The city lights flickered on as Alex stared at the sketch in his hands. His life, once perfectly planned, now a chaotic but beautiful mess. "You're my sons," he declared, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. But as doubt lingers in their hearts, can Alex truly keep them? One thing is certain. Everything is about to change. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Alexander White had spent his entire life constructing an empire, controlling every detail of his world with precision. Power, influence, and wealth, these were the pillars of his existence. He was not a man who believed in surprises. Surprises meant uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place in his carefully structured life. Until today. He had just stepped into the opulent lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel in New York, his mind already occupied with high-stakes business negotiations. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the hum of quiet conversations mixed with the classical symphony floating through the air. He moved toward the reception desk, fully expecting another seamless check-in to his penthouse suite, when an unfamiliar voice stopped him. Mr. White. It was hesitant but firm. He barely registered it at first, assuming it belonged to a hotel employee. But something in the tone, something urgent, made him turn. Standing a few feet away were two young boys, no older than 10, identical. Their dark brown hair was slightly tousled. Their piercing blue eyes locked onto his with a mixture of nervousness and unshakable determination. Their clothes were neat but simple, not the polished attire of privilege. One clutched a worn-out backpack, holding it tightly as if it contained everything that mattered to him in the world. Alexander frowned. Strangers, especially children, did not approach him. "Yes," he responded, his voice cool, measured. The boys exchanged a glance, as if deciding who should speak. Finally, the one gripping the backpack stepped forward. "We need to talk to you," he said, his voice steadier than Alexander expected from a child his age. A flicker of curiosity broke through Alexander's usual detachment. Who were they? What could they possibly want? He glanced around the lobby, aware of a few inquisitive gazes. He disliked unnecessary attention. "I'm sorry, but do I know you?" he asked, already preparing to dismiss whatever this was. The second boy, who had been silent until now, took a deep breath. Then, with unwavering conviction, he met Alexander's gaze head-on and spoke the 4 words that shattered everything he thought he knew about his life. "You are our father." The air in the room seemed to still. The background noise, the soft clinking of glasses, the quiet conversations, the elegant symphony, vanished into nothingness. Alexander White, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, the man who never lost control, the man who always had an answer, was suddenly, for the first time in his life, speechless. His heart pounded, his mind raced, searching for logic, for an explanation, for a reason why these boys, these strangers, were looking at him like they belonged to him. Sons? Impossible. Yet, as he looked into their eyes that mirrored his own, he felt the first crack in the life he had so meticulously built. And for the first time, Alexander White was forced to ask himself a question he had never considered before. What if the greatest thing he had ever built was not his empire, but them? Alexander White had built his life on power, precision, and control. Everything he touched turned to gold, and every move he made was calculated. He had no weaknesses, no regrets, and certainly no loose ends. At least, that was what he had believed, until today. 2 boys, no older than 10, stood before him, their eyes holding a truth he was not ready to hear. "You are our father." The words hit like a wrecking ball, shattering the foundation of his carefully curated world. For the first time in years, Alexander White was speechless. His mind instantly rejected the possibility. He had no children. He had never been married. He had never been in a situation where he could have fathered 2 boys without knowing about it. And yet there they stood, identical in every way, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that mirrored his own. A moment passed. Stretching endlessly between them, Alex did not speak, but the first boy, the one clutching a worn-out backpack, took a deep breath and pressed on. "Our mom, she passed away a few weeks ago. Before she died, she told us who you were." A chill ran through Alex's veins, cold and sharp. The way they spoke, steady, unwavering, made it impossible to dismiss them outright. This was not a scam. He could feel it, and yet the logical part of his brain still fought against the idea. "Who was your mother?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as if bracing for an answer he already feared. "Lillian Brooks," the second boy answered without hesitation. The name sent a shockwave through him. Lillian, he had not thought about her in nearly a decade. But the moment her name left the boy's lips, memories surged to the surface, unwelcome, undeniable. Lillian Brooks had been a firestorm, full of laughter, passion, and wild dreams. They had shared a brief but intense romance, one that had burned brightly before fading into nothing. Their worlds had never fit together. He had been too focused on building an empire. She had been chasing a life free from constraints. And then, one day, she was gone. No goodbyes, no explanations. He had never looked back. Now, standing before him were 2 living, breathing consequences of his past. The realization hit him like a slow, sinking weight. The timelines fit. Their resemblance to him was undeniable. Why did she not tell me? He whispered the question more to himself than to them. The boy with the backpack shrugged. "We do not know. She just told us you were our dad. And now she is gone. We had nowhere else to go." Alex exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. This was impossible. And yet, here they were. What unsettled him more? The possibility that they were telling the truth, or the gut-wrenching realization that if they were, he had missed 10 years of their lives without ever knowing they existed? "Come with me," he finally said, his voice firm but not unkind. The boys exchanged a glance, then nodded. Alex turned and led them toward the elevator, his mind a storm of questions with no answers. If they were truly his children, if Lillian had kept this from him for a decade, then his life was about to change in ways he could have never prepared for. For the first time in his carefully controlled world, Alexander White had no idea what would happen next. The elevator ride was silent. The only sounds were the soft hum of the machinery and the occasional ding as they ascended. Alex kept his hands in his pockets, stealing glances at the boys beside him. Now that he had time to really look, the resemblance was even more striking. The sharp angles of their faces, the way their brows furrowed slightly in thought, the quiet intensity in their eyes. It was like looking into a mirror. "They are mine." The thought shook him to his core. When the elevator doors slid open, he led them into his penthouse, a sleek, modern space of marble and glass, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering skyline. He had always loved this view. It represented everything he had built, everything he had conquered. But tonight, for the first time, it felt empty. The boys hesitated in the doorway, uncertain, out of place. Alex took a slow breath, turning to face them fully. "Tell me everything." And just like that, his world would never be the same again. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a breathtaking display of glittering lights against the night sky. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy with silence. The 2 boys hesitated at the entrance, their gazes sweeping over the pristine furniture, the perfectly arranged decor, the cold elegance of the penthouse. It was clear this was not a home where children had ever lived. There were no scattered toys, no cozy mess of everyday life. Just a space built for a man who had spent years prioritizing power and success over everything else. Alex watched them, their small frames standing awkwardly at the threshold of a life they had never known. "Come in," he said finally, his voice measured, motioning them inside. They stepped in cautiously, their movements uncertain, as if afraid they might break something just by breathing too hard. Alex walked toward the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and turned to face them. "You should start from the beginning," he said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to emotion. "How did you find me?" The boy with the backpack, who Alex was beginning to suspect was the more outspoken of the two, unzipped it and pulled out a small, slightly worn envelope. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward Alex without a word. "Mom left this for us," he said. Alex stared at the envelope, his fingers hovering over it for a second before finally picking it up. The paper felt fragile between his hands, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "Lillian," his chest tightened as he unfolded the letter. "Alex, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and Jake and Oliver have come looking for you. I know you probably have a million questions, and I wish I could be the one to answer them. The truth is, I made a choice a long time ago not to tell you. You were building your future, and I did not want to be the one to disrupt it. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, that the boys would be better off not knowing a father who was too busy for them. But I see now that I was wrong. They deserve to know who you are, and you deserve to know them. They are good kids, Alex, smart, kind, stronger than they should have to be. And now, they have no one but you. I hope you do right by them. Lillian." Alex exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the letter before he carefully set it down. His emotions churned, anger, guilt, confusion, all fighting for space in his mind. She had kept them from him for 10 years. 10 years. And yet, she had been right. If she had told him back then, would he have stepped up? Or would he have convinced himself his career was more important than raising 2 children? His throat felt tight as he looked up at the boys. Jake and Oliver, his sons. "You have been on your own since she passed." His voice was quieter now, less controlled than he would have liked. Oliver, the quieter of the two, finally spoke. "We stayed with a neighbor for a while, but she could not keep us. Social workers were going to put us in foster care, so we ran away." His voice was steady, but his eyes, his guarded, wary eyes, told a different story. Alex ran a hand down his face. "You ran away?" His voice dropped, the weight of the situation pressing hard on his chest. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" Jake lifted his chin slightly, a flash of defiance in his stance. It was better than being separated. That hit Alex harder than he expected. The thought of them being split up, thrown into a system where no one knew them, where no one cared, sent an unfamiliar ache through him. He took a slow breath, processing everything, then nodded. "All right." Jake frowned slightly, his expression skeptical. "All right." Alex met his gaze, unwavering. "You are staying here." He said it simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. For the first time since they had arrived, the boys exchanged a look of surprise, almost disbelief. Jake's fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack, his walls still up. "Why?" "Because," Alex said, his voice firm, "you are mine." And just like that, the life he had carefully built, his world of control, strategy, and calculated moves shifted beneath his feet. Because for the first time in years, Alexander White had something to lose. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Alex had said in years. Asterisk, "You're staying here." Asterisk. Jake and Oliver exchanged uncertain glances. Their eyes flickered with doubt, as if waiting for the catch, for him to change his mind and send them away. Just like that, Oliver finally asked, his voice cautious, testing the waters. Alex leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, his expression unwavering. "Just like that? You said you had nowhere else to go. Now you do." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Jake nodded as if accepting that this was real. Oliver followed a second later. Alex took a deep breath. the weight of his own words settling in. The truth was, he had no idea what he was doing. He had never pictured himself as a father, let alone to two 10-year-old boys who had lived an entire decade without him. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He was not going to let them go. Not now. Not ever. Hashtag the next morning. Alex was used to silence. He preferred it, in fact. His world ran on control, on precision. His mornings were typically filled with nothing but the quiet hum of his espresso machine and the faint rustle of business reports. But this silence felt different. It was heavier, because now he knew two kids were sleeping down the hall, and that changed everything. He woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or an early meeting, but because something inside him refused to rest. Pulling on a t-shirt, he stepped into the hallway, pausing outside the guest room. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently. The bed was empty. His heart jumped. The room was mostly untouched except for the two backpacks near the bed. The sight made his stomach tighten. Had they left? Had they decided they did not want to stay with a stranger who barely knew what he was doing? His mind raced with worst-case scenarios as he turned quickly toward the living room. But the moment he stepped into the open space of the penthouse, his shoulders relaxed. They were still here. Both boys sat on the floor in front of the coffee table, quietly eating bowls of cereal. Jake was flipping through channels on the TV remote, while Oliver sat cross-legged, engrossed in a book. They looked up as he walked in. "You're up early," Jake said casually before turning back to the TV. Alex let out a breath he had not even realized he was holding. "So are you." Oliver shrugged. "We are used to waking up early." Alex rubbed the back of his neck. He was not sure what the protocol was here. Was he supposed to ask if they had slept well? If they needed anything? What did kids even eat for breakfast? But from the looks of it, they had already figured that out for themselves. He walked into the kitchen, glancing at the cereal box left on the counter. "You guys just helped yourselves?" he asked. Jake shot him a look, one eyebrow raised. "We did not think you would cook." Alex smirked slightly. "Good call." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching them. It was strange, this feeling of not knowing what came next. He was used to entering meetings with a plan, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But with Jake and Oliver, he was just taking things moment by moment, completely unsure of the right move. Finally, he set his mug down and exhaled. "I figured today we could go get some clothes, some stuff for you both. Whatever you need." Jake hesitated, then glanced at Oliver, who merely nodded in response. "Okay," Jake said. It was a simple word, but Alex knew it carried weight. It meant they were staying. And for the first time in years, Alex White, ruthless businessman, master strategist, the man who always knew the next step, had no idea what the future held. But for once, that did not terrify him. It gave him something he had not felt in a long time. Purpose. Alex exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he studied the 2 boys sitting before him. "We need to get some things for you. Clothes, school supplies, whatever else you need," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. Jake gave him a suspicious look. "You do not have people who do that for you." Alex let out a small breath, amused by the sharpness in Jake's tone. "I do. But I figured you would want to pick your own stuff." Oliver, who had been quietly flipping through the pages of his book, set it down and met Alex's gaze. "Are we going to school?" Alex hesitated for just a second. That was something he had not thought about yet. Of course, they needed to be in school. But making it official, enrolling them, signing the paperwork, somehow made everything feel even more real, more permanent. "Yes," he said after a moment, "but let us take this one step at a time." The boys exchanged a glance, some silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Jake just shrugged and went back to his cereal, as if deciding not to push the topic further. The shopping trip. Later that morning, Alex took them downtown to a department store. This was completely foreign territory for him. He was used to shopping for tailored suits, expensive watches, and high-end accessories. But walking through aisles of kids' clothing, that was an experience he had never imagined himself having. The boys, however, knew exactly what they were doing. They moved efficiently, picking out jeans, hoodies, and sneakers. Practical things, nothing flashy or excessive. But Alex noticed something that made his chest tighten. They checked the price tags. Every single time. Even when they hesitated over a pair of sneakers, their eyes lingered on the small white sticker more than the shoes themselves. "You do not have to worry about the cost," Alex said, watching them carefully. Jake glanced up at him. "We are just not used to this." Alex frowned slightly. He knew they had lived modestly with their mother, but the way they hesitated, as if they were afraid of taking too much, made something heavy settle inside him. He did not want them to feel like they had to hold back. "You are not going to go crazy and buy 10 pairs of shoes," he said, his tone light. "But you also do not have to act like I am going to take it all away if you pick something nice." Jake studied him for a second, then after a small pause, nodded and grabbed the sneakers he actually wanted. It was a small moment, but to Alex, it felt like a win. Lunch at the diner. After the shopping trip, they stopped at a small diner for lunch. The boys were quieter than before, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was more like they were adjusting to this new reality, just as he was. As they ate, Alex found himself watching them closely, picking up on small details. Jake was the more outspoken one, quick to respond, sharp with his words, always testing the waters. Oliver was quieter, more observant, the kind of kid who thought carefully before he spoke. And yet, in both of them, Alex saw pieces of himself. Their mannerisms, the way they carried themselves, even the way Oliver furrowed his brow in deep thought. It was almost like looking into a mirror. He had spent 10 years not knowing they existed, and yet, here they were, his sons, flesh and blood. "You guys want to do anything else today?" Alex asked as he finished his coffee. Oliver looked thoughtful for a moment. Then, softly, he asked, "Can we go to a bookstore?" Alex blinked, a little surprised. "A bookstore?" Oliver nodded. "Mom used to take us all the time." The words hit Alex harder than he expected. There were so many details, small, simple things about their lives, that he had never been a part of. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their birthdays. He had not been there when their mother read them bedtime stories. And now, sitting across from them in a tiny diner, he was painfully aware of just how much time had already slipped through his fingers. But maybe, just maybe, it was not too late to start now. Alex placed his coffee cup down and nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go to a bookstore." And for the first time in years, he did not care about schedules, business deals, or stock reports. For the first time in years, something else mattered more. For years, bookstores had been their mother's safe haven, a place where she had shaped them, nurtured them, and built a world within pages. Every trip with her had been a lesson, every book a quiet embrace. But she was gone now, and Alex was here. Maybe that was what mattered. Alex exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, we can go to a bookstore." Jake smirked, tilting his head. "You do not seem like the type of guy who reads a lot." Alex let out a soft chuckle. "I read, just not for fun." Oliver, who had been reserved all day, finally smiled, a small, fleeting curve of his lips. "Maybe we will find you something to change that." Something about that moment settled deep in Alex's chest. He had no idea what kind of father he was supposed to be. No manual, no blueprint, no certainty that he would not mess it all up. But as he sat there, looking at his sons, he realized something. He did not need to have it all figured out. He just needed to show up. And for now, that was enough. Hashtag the shift. Alex had always lived by routine. Every moment of his day was planned. Wake up at precisely 5:30 a.m. Morning run, black coffee, Back-to-back meetings, power lunches, stock reports, business deals, dinner alone, bed. His world revolved around schedules, efficiency, and absolute control. But now, there were two 10-year-olds living under his roof. And suddenly, the silence he had once relied on was gone. His penthouse had always been eerily quiet, a space designed for a man too busy to live in it. The only sounds had been the hum of the city beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows and the occasional beep of his phone. Now, it was filled with life. Footsteps ran down the hallway. Dishes clattered in the kitchen as the boys tried, and often failed, to make breakfast. Muffled laughter and playful bickering spilled from their room, their voices breaking through the walls like warmth seeping into cold stone. Alex had never realized just how empty his life had been, until now. Hashtag the kitchen incident. One morning, as Alex walked into the kitchen, he paused at the sight before him. Jake was standing on a chair, reaching for the top shelf where Alex kept the cereal. Oliver stood nearby, arms crossed, unimpressed. "You are going to fall." Jake ignored him, stretching even further. "I have got it." Alex leaned casually against the counter, watching the struggle unfold. "You know, you could just ask for help." Jake flinched at the sound of his voice, startled. His foot slipped. Alex moved instinctively, gripping his arm before he could crash to the floor and setting him back down safely. Jake sighed, clearly annoyed. "I had it." Alex smirked. "Sure you did." Without another word, he pulled the cereal box from the shelf and handed it to him. Oliver smirked. "Told you." Jake rolled his eyes but took the box anyway, mumbling something under his breath. Alex watched as they settled at the counter, eating like they had done this 1,000 times before, like they belonged here. And maybe they did. Hashtag a question he was not ready for. As Alex sipped his coffee, lost in thought, Jake suddenly looked up. "So, what exactly do you do all day?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jake shrugged. "You are always checking your phone, looking all serious. Is your job just being a businessman?" Alex smirked. "Pretty much." Oliver, who had been quiet until now, glanced up. "Do you like it?" Alex stilled. No one had ever asked him that before. His entire life had been about climbing higher, making more, winning. He had spent years convincing himself that success meant happiness. Did he like it? For the first time in years, he did not have an answer. "I am good at it," he said finally. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying him. "That is not the same thing." Alex met his gaze, slightly impressed. "No, it is not." The conversation drifted after that, but the question stayed with Alex, digging into his thoughts like an itch he could not scratch. Had he built his life around something he did not even enjoy? Or had he just never stopped to wonder? But he pushed the thought aside. He had more immediate things to figure out, like what he was supposed to do with these boys all day. Hashtag a new plan. Alex cleared his throat. "Since you're going to be staying here for a while, we need to set up some things. School activities, maybe sports." He paused, glancing between them. "Anything you guys are interested in?" Jake shrugged, stirring his cereal. "I used to play..." He trailed off, his voice quieter now. Alex waited. Jake hesitated for just a second before shaking his head. "Never mind." Alex frowned slightly, but did not push. He was learning that these boys, his sons, had walls built from years of loss, uncertainty, and learning to fend for themselves. But he was here now, and brick by brick, he was going to break those walls down. Not with grand gestures, not with empty words, but by simply being here, by showing up, by choosing them every single day. The sound of Oliver's pencil scratching against the paper was the only noise in the otherwise silent kitchen. His brow furrowed in deep concentration, the tip of the pencil moving with fluid precision across the page. Alex stood across from him, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in his hand, observing his son. The raw intensity of Oliver's focus reminded him just how little he truly knew about this boy he was now trying so desperately to connect with. Meanwhile, Jake stood in front of the fridge, staring into it as though the contents would reveal some great secret. His hand hovered over the shelves, waiting for something to magically appear. "You just gonna stand there all morning, or are you actually gonna pick something?" Alex asked, his voice light, but with an edge that carried a hint of amusement. Jake turned his head slightly, his eyes shifting toward his father, his voice flat. "I'm thinking," he replied. Alex raised an eyebrow and smirked. "You think a lot for someone who eats the same thing every day." Jake rolled his eyes, a playful defiance crossing his face as he grabbed a yogurt. Oliver didn't even seem to hear them, lost in his world of sketches. Alex's eyes lingered on the drawing for a moment, a skyline, detailed and full of life. Yet it spoke of a world far removed from the one Alex had known. "You're pretty good," Alex remarked, nodding toward the sketchbook. Oliver paused, glancing up at his father. His face was unreadable, his eyes distant as he simply shrugged. "Mom taught me—" The words hit Alex like a wave crashing against a cliffside. That familiar pang of guilt clenched in his chest. Every time the boys spoke of their mother, it reminded him of the years he had missed, the years he had allowed to slip away, too absorbed in his own world to see what truly mattered. He hated that he had been absent for so much of their lives, that he had no idea what Lillian had been like as a mother. But one thing was clear, she had done something right. These boys were independent, smart, and far more mature than most kids their age. They were far beyond the reach of anything Alex had imagined. "She must have been proud of you," Alex said softly, unable to stop the words from escaping. His heart twisted as Oliver hesitated for just a moment before giving a slight nod. "She always said I was better than her," Oliver murmured, the words almost a whisper, as if speaking them aloud might make them too real. His voice held the weight of a lifetime, of silent lessons passed down, of a mother's quiet confidence. Alex stood still, the air thick with the unspoken words between them. He had spent his entire life proving himself to the world, climbing higher, building empires, showing people that he was capable, reliable, and powerful. But now, standing in the kitchen with these two boys who barely knew him, he realized something far more important was at stake. This wasn't just about proving himself to anyone else. This was about proving to Jake and Oliver that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was going to fight to be the father they deserved. They had spent years without him, and no matter how much he wished he could undo the past, trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. The distance between them was palpable, an invisible wall of hurt and confusion that neither of them fully understood yet. After a quiet breakfast, they set out to find a school, but for Alex, it was more than just a practical decision. He had always believed that the best school was the most prestigious, the one with the best rankings, the best reputation. But as he watched the boys explore the campuses, it became clear to him that their needs were different. They weren't impressed by grand libraries or cutting-edge technology. They cared about things that had never occurred to him before. Was the staff kind? Did the school have a baseball field? Was there a place for Oliver's art? At the end of the day, they chose a school. It wasn't the most expensive or prestigious, but it was the one that felt right for them. Alex had never let anyone else make a decision for him, especially one so important. But this time, he didn't mind. He realized that sometimes it wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what they needed. That night, as the boys prepared for bed, Alex passed by their rooms. Their voices reached him through the slightly cracked door. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the conversation caught his attention. "Do you think he's serious?" Jake asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," Oliver replied, but he didn't have to let us stay. There was a pause, heavy and full of unspoken thoughts. Then Jake sighed. "I guess we'll see." Alex stood there for a moment, frozen in place, before silently walking away. The words hit him harder than he expected. For so many years, he had been determined to prove his worth in the business world, always focused on achievement and success. But now, he had something else to prove. He had to show his sons that he was serious, that he wasn't going anywhere, and that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't willing to let them go. The next few days were filled with adjustments, learning how to coexist in a new life, how to live as a family after so many years apart. The boys were polite, respectful, but there was still a distance between them. They were strangers to him, and he to them. Trust couldn't be rebuilt in a matter of days, or even weeks. It would take time, but Alex was committed. He wasn't going to lose another day. He watched Oliver sketching again, his face locked in concentration. The weight of his words lingered, and Alex felt something stir in his chest. There was so much to make up for, so much he had missed. But maybe, just maybe, this was where the real work began. And maybe, for the first time, Alex was willing to do the hardest thing of all, be present. Alex took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth of the cup grounding him as his eyes drifted to Oliver. The boy was hunched over his sketchbook, lost in his world of lines and shadows, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. It was a quiet morning, the kind Alex had never really appreciated before. In his world, there had always been noise, endless meetings, phone calls, and the constant pressure to climb higher, to achieve more. But here, in this moment with his sons, who still felt like strangers, Alex felt the weight of a different kind of pressure, the kind that was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and entirely new. Could do anything if I worked hard enough, Alex murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Oliver looked up at him, eyes wide, as if he hadn't expected such a comment from his father. It was clear that the boy wasn't used to hearing something so raw, so personal, from anyone other than his mother. Jake, who had been silently eating his cereal, suddenly spoke up, his voice sharp and full of curiosity. "What about you? What did your parents teach you?" The question hit Alex like a sudden gust of wind, unanticipated and impossible to ignore. He set his coffee down, his hand lingering on the mug for a moment as the weight of the question settled in his chest. He hadn't been asked that in years. His parents, if they could be called that, had never been the kind to teach him life lessons. His father had been ruthless, not just in business, but in every aspect of life. His mother had been obsessed with appearances, more concerned with social standing than with nurturing a relationship with her son. "I learned how to work hard," Alex said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken truths. Jake studied him for a moment, his eyes searching, trying to peel back the layers of Alex's carefully constructed persona. "That's it." Alex felt a surge of irritation, but it quickly passed. "That's what mattered to them," he said with a shrug. Oliver tilted his head, his gaze soft but piercing. "Is that what matters to you?" The question echoed in Alex's mind, reverberating through the quiet space of the kitchen. For most of his life, success had been everything: building his company, growing his wealth, proving to the world and to himself that he was capable, that he was untouchable. He had lived for those things, those markers of achievement. But now, sitting in this quiet, unfamiliar kitchen, watching the two boys who were his sons but still felt like strangers, Alex wasn't so sure anymore. "I used to think so," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But things change." Jake didn't push any further, but the way he looked at Alex, half curiosity, half calculation, made it clear that he was still trying to figure him out. Trying to figure out if this man who sat before him was someone worth trusting. Later that afternoon, Alex decided to take them to one of the exclusive sports complexes he frequented. It was the kind of high-end facility meant for professional athletes and high-profile executives, the kind where the elite could escape the pressures of their public lives and indulge in the best equipment money could buy. It had been months since Alex had visited, but it was the first thing that came to mind when he thought about how to occupy two energetic 10-year-olds. When they arrived, Jake's eyes lit up as he spotted the baseball field. "We can play here?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Alex nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, you said you used to play, right?" Jake grinned widely, the spark of excitement unmistakable. Yeah, but never somewhere like this. Oliver, on the other hand, was less enthusiastic. He seemed more drawn to the basketball court, his movements quiet and methodical, though there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. Alex could tell that his son wasn't as overt with his emotions as Jake, but there was a deep interest simmering just below the surface. "You guys can do whatever you want," Alex said, offering them the freedom to explore. "Just don't break anything." Jake dashed off toward the batting cages, while Oliver meandered toward the court, dribbling a basketball with a quiet intensity. Alex sat down on the bleachers, his gaze following them. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of displacement. He was used to leading board meetings, negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, making decisions that affected the futures of entire companies. But sitting here, watching his sons, his kids, kids, was an experience that was both foreign and oddly comforting. As the day wore on, Jake came over, slightly out of breath, his face flushed with exertion. "You play?" he asked, tossing a glove to Alex. Alex raised an eyebrow. "Baseball? Not since I was your age." Jake grinned mischievously. "Then let's see if you're any good." Alex sighed, rolling his shoulders and standing up. "All right, but if I embarrass myself, we're never speaking of this again." To his surprise, Alex wasn't terrible. He wasn't great either, but he could still catch and throw well enough to keep up with Jake. Oliver eventually joined in, and for the first time since their arrival, Alex saw the boys laughing, really laughing. Not just polite smiles or forced grins, but true, genuine joy. At one point, Alex caught Jake glancing at him, and for a split second, he swore he saw something like approval in the boy's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As they piled into the car to head home, Jake spoke up. "Today wasn't bad." Alex smirked, glancing at his son in the rearview mirror. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me so far." Jake shrugged nonchalantly. "You're still figuring things out, but you're trying." Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, and that's more than we expected." Alex wasn't sure if that should make him feel better or worse. He knew he still had a long way to go before the boys fully trusted him, but at least he was making progress. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, Alex was willing to walk it. The next few days were filled with small but significant adjustments. Alex had spent years living alone, accustomed to silence, to order, to a life that revolved around his work. Now, his days were filled with noise, unpredictability, and a growing list of things he had never considered before. What food the boys liked, how to get them enrolled in school, what it meant to be responsible for someone other than himself. One evening, after a long day at the office, Alex walked into the penthouse to find the boys in the living room. Oliver was sitting on the couch, sketching in his notebook, just as he always did. Jake was sprawled out on the floor, watching some random show on TV. They both looked up when he entered, their expressions unreadable, but there was a change. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Alex to see that the distance between them, the wall of uncertainty that had surrounded their relationship, was slowly starting to crumble. And for the first time, Alex wasn't just working to prove himself to the world. He was working to prove himself to them, to show his sons that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was ready to learn what it meant to be the kind of father they needed. The road ahead was uncertain, but Alex had never been more determined. Jake sprawled on the floor, absorbed in a baseball game on the massive TV screen, the room around him a reflection of the chaos that had come with two young boys in Alex's life. Snack wrappers cluttered the coffee table. A stray sock lay abandoned near the couch, and a half-open backpack spilled school forms across the floor. It was a mess, but somehow, Alex didn't feel the usual wave of irritation he'd have felt in the past. He simply sighed, set his briefcase down, and leaned against the wall, letting the clutter wash over him without resistance. Jake barely glanced up, his eyes still glued to the screen. "You look tired," he observed, his voice casual. Alex smirked, not needing to respond. It was obvious Oliver, perched across the room with a sketch pad, didn't miss the exchange. His eyes briefly met Alex's, and in that quiet moment, there was a depth in his gaze that spoke volumes. "You work too much," Oliver said, the words soft, almost as if he was speaking to someone who had forgotten what it meant to stop. Alex loosened his tie, pulling it free as he glanced at Oliver. "That's what happens when you run a company," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of years spent chasing success. Jake raised an eyebrow, the question lingering between them like an unspoken dare. "Ever thought about doing something else?" Alex chuckled, sinking further into the armchair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. "Like what?" he asked, more out of amusement than expectation. Jake shrugged nonchalantly. I don't know, something fun." The word echoed in Alex's mind, stirring something long buried. Fun. It was a foreign concept to him. He had spent his entire adult life building his empire, each day consumed by the need to climb higher, faster, stronger. Fun wasn't part of the equation. Even his travels had been for business. Even his social gatherings were strategic, networking events designed to further his success. "What do you guys consider fun?" he asked, the question almost leaving his lips without thought. Jake's smirk was instant. "Baseball, obviously." Oliver, who had been tapping his pencil against his sketch pad, looked up at him with a quiet intensity. "Reading, drawing, just having time to do stuff you actually like." Alex mulled over their answers, realizing how far he had strayed from the things that once mattered. His life had been a series of calculated moves, always thinking 10 steps ahead. But now, in the presence of 2 kids who valued moments of joy and simple pleasures, he realized he had lost something precious: the ability to stop to breathe, to enjoy. A sudden thought struck him, the idea so absurd it took him by surprise. "You two ever been to an amusement park?" he asked. Jake's eyes widened. "Like a real one? With roller coasters?" Alex nodded, a glint of excitement in his voice. "Yeah, a real one. How about this weekend?" Oliver shook his head, his voice tinged with regret. "Mom never had time to take us." Alex leaned forward, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Well, I have time now. How about we go?" Jake looked skeptical, but there was an undeniable curiosity in his gaze. "You? At an amusement park? Wearing what? A 3-piece suit?" Alex smirked, his confidence returning. "I do own normal clothes, you know." Oliver laughed, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "I'll believe it when I see it." When the weekend finally arrived, Alex had arranged for them to visit one of the largest amusement parks just outside the city. It was chaotic, crowded, and utterly exhausting, just as he had expected. But what he didn't expect was that he would actually enjoy it. Jake bolted ahead, his excitement contagious, dragging Oliver along with him. The first ride was a roller coaster with multiple loops, and to Alex's surprise, he found himself climbing aboard. It was fast, disorienting, and nothing he would have chosen to do on his own. But when the ride ended and he saw the boys grinning at him, the thrill of the moment settled in. He didn't regret it, not for a second. They spent the day trying different rides, playing carnival games, and even stopped for lunch at one of the overpriced food stands. Jake won a stuffed bear at a basketball shooting game and immediately handed it to Oliver, who rolled his eyes but took it anyway. The small exchange between the boys was something Alex didn't fully understand yet, but he cherished it all the same. At one point, while waiting in line for another ride, Oliver looked up at Alex, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom would have liked this." Alex glanced at him, the lump in his throat tightening. "Yeah?" he asked softly. Oliver nodded. "She always wanted us to have fun, even when things were hard." The words hit Alex harder than he expected. He had spent so much time beating himself up over the things he hadn't been there for, the moments he had missed while chasing the ever-elusive goal of success. But perhaps what mattered more wasn't what he hadn't done, but what he was doing now. That evening, when they returned home, the boys crashed immediately, exhausted from the long day. Alex stood in the hallway, staring at their closed bedroom doors, a quiet realization sweeping over him. Just weeks ago, he had walked into a hotel room, convinced that he was just a businessman, someone who controlled every aspect of his life with precision. But now, he was a father, an identity that was still taking shape one day at a time. And in that moment, Alex realized that his life had already changed more than he could have imagined. Adjusting to life with Jake and Oliver had been slow. Every day, Alex found himself learning more about what it meant to be a father. It wasn't just about providing for them, ensuring they had food, clothes, and shelter. It was about the little things. The way Oliver absent-mindedly tapped his pencil when he was lost in thought. The way Jake tested every rule just to see if Alex would actually enforce it. He even noticed the hesitancy in their voices when they asked for things, as though they were still unsure if they had the right to ask at all. One evening, Alex returned home earlier than usual, something he would never have done before the boys entered his life. He walked into the penthouse to find Oliver sitting on the couch, reading a book, while Jake lay on the floor, tossing a baseball in the air and catching it. The faint smell of burnt toast lingered in the air, and when Alex glanced toward the kitchen, he saw a plate of half-eaten sandwiches on the counter. "You guys attempted to cook?" Alex raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his voice. Oliver didn't look up. "We made grilled cheese." Jake grinned. "Mostly." Alex walked over to inspect the mess they'd made. "I assume mostly means the first few were disasters." Jake stretched his arms behind his head. "More like Oliver forgot you have to butter the bread first." Oliver shot him a look. "I didn't forget. I just didn't know." Alex shook his head, amused. "Remind me to show you how to use the stove properly before you burn the place down." Jake stretched again. "You actually cook?" Alex leaned against the counter, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I know how. I just never have the time." Oliver looked up, his gaze sharp. "You have time now." The words hit Alex like a jolt of electricity. He had spent his entire life filling every second of his schedule with work, convinced that time was his most valuable asset. But now, for the first time, he was being forced to slow down, and suddenly he wasn't sure if he hated it, or if he was starting to understand why it mattered. "I guess I do," Alex said after a long pause. "Maybe I'll teach you both something that doesn't involve burning bread." Jake smirked. "Sounds like a challenge." The next day, Alex did something he'd never done before. He canceled a meeting so he could be home in time to cook dinner with the boys. He didn't tell them in advance, unsure if he'd actually follow through. But when he walked through the door, carrying a bag of groceries instead of his usual briefcase, their surprise was unmistakable. "You actually meant it?" Jake asked, watching as Alex set the bag on the counter. Alex rolled up his sleeves with a grin. "What? You thought I was bluffing?" Oliver stood up, mildly impressed. "I mean, yeah." Alex smirked. "Well, you're about to learn that I don't bluff." He wasn't an expert chef, but he knew enough to get by. He taught them how to make pasta from scratch, showing them how to knead the dough, roll it out, and cut it into strips. At first, Jake was more interested in seeing how much flour he could get on the counter, while Oliver focused intently on perfecting the shapes. But Alex found himself surprisingly patient, explaining each step, answering their questions, and watching as they slowly began to get the hang of it. By the time they were sitting at the table, enjoying their creation, Jake leaned back in his chair, a contented smile spreading across his face. "Okay, I'll admit it. This was actually kind of fun." Oliver nodded, savoring a bite. "Tastes better than the stuff from a box." Alex smirked. "Because you made it yourselves." Jake studied him for a moment, then set his fork down. "You know, you're not as bad at this as I thought you'd be." Alex raised an eyebrow, surprised. "At cooking?" Jake shrugged, but there was something more to his tone, something hesitant, like he was testing Alex, wondering if this newfound closeness was just temporary, or if it was real. "I told you," Alex said, holding his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." The apartment was cluttered, the remnants of a busy day scattered around. Empty snack wrappers strewn across the coffee table, a stray sock abandoned near the couch, and a backpack half-zipped, spilling out forms for school. Normally, such chaos would have filled Alex with irritation, but today was different. As he dropped his briefcase onto the floor, he felt an unexpected sense of calm. His gaze fell on Jake, who was engrossed in the baseball game on TV, barely noticing his arrival. "You look tired," Jake muttered without glancing up. Alex smirked, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. That obvious Oliver, sitting at the table with a sketch pad, didn't miss the chance to weigh in. "You work too much," he observed, tapping his pencil against the pad. Alex loosened his tie and sank into the armchair. "That's what happens when you run a company," he said, his voice tinged with both pride and exhaustion. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Ever think about doing something else?" Alex chuckled, sinking deeper into the chair, considering the question. "Like what?" He almost didn't mean it, but there was a momentary flicker of curiosity in his voice. Jake shrugged. "I don't know, something fun." Alex tilted his head, studying his son's earnest face. Fun? It had been a long time since that word had crossed his mind. His life had been a blur of meetings, deals, and the relentless pursuit of success. He had spent so long building his empire that he'd forgotten what it felt like to enjoy something for its own sake. "What do you guys consider fun?" Alex asked, half smiling. Jake grinned. "Baseball, obviously." Oliver, not missing a beat, added, "Reading, drawing, just doing stuff you actually like." The weight of their words lingered in the air, and Alex realized how much he had neglected the simplest pleasures of life. His mind had always been focused on what came next, the next deal, the next project, the next challenge. He had never stopped long enough to understand what life outside of his work was supposed to look like. A sudden thought crossed his mind, one he hadn't considered before. "You guys ever been to an amusement park?" Jake's eyes widened with excitement. "A real one? With roller coasters?" Alex nodded, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. Oliver shook his head. "Mom never had time to take us," he said quietly. Alex leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Well, I have time now. How about we go this weekend?" Jake eyed him skeptically. "You? At an amusement park? In a three-piece suit?" Alex's grin widened. "I do own normal clothes, you know." Oliver laughed. "I'll believe it when I see it." The weekend came, and to his surprise, Alex found himself enjoying the chaos of the amusement park. It was crowded, noisy, and everything he had expected. But there was something else, too. Something that felt right. Jake ran ahead, excited to try every ride, dragging Oliver along with him. The day was full of laughter, screams of excitement, and shared joy. They tried every ride, played carnival games, and even stopped for overpriced snacks. At one point, Jake won a stuffed bear at a basketball game and, with a smirk, handed it to Oliver, who rolled his eyes but accepted it anyway. In the middle of the fun, as they waited in line for yet another ride, Oliver looked up at Alex. "Mom would have liked this," he said, his voice soft. Alex glanced at him, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "She always wanted us to have fun, even when things were hard." Alex swallowed hard, thinking about how much time he had spent regretting the things he had missed out on. But in that moment, surrounded by the laughter of the boys and the buzz of the park, he realized that what mattered more was what he was doing now. That evening, as they returned home, the boys crashed into their beds, exhausted from the long day. Alex stood in the hallway, staring at their closed doors. He had walked into this whole situation only weeks ago, thinking he was just a businessman, someone who had mastered control and precision in every aspect of his life. But now, he was a father, and while the transition had been slow and difficult, he could see that something had changed in him. He was no longer just thinking about work. He was thinking about them. Adjusting to life with Jake and Oliver wasn't easy. It was a process, filled with stumbles and awkward moments, But every day Alex found himself learning something new about fatherhood. It wasn't just about providing for them. It was about the small moments. The way Oliver tapped his pencil absent-mindedly when he was lost in thought, or how Jake tested the limits of every rule, just to see if Alex would enforce them. One evening, Alex returned home earlier than usual, a rare occurrence before the boys came into his life. As he entered the penthouse, he found Oliver sitting on the couch, absorbed in a book, while Jake lay on the floor, tossing a baseball into the air. A faint smell of burnt toast lingered in the kitchen, and Alex noticed a plate of half-eaten sandwiches on the counter. "You guys attempted to cook?" Alex asked, raising an eyebrow. Oliver didn't even look up from his book. "We made grilled cheese." Jake grinned. "Mostly." Alex walked over to inspect the mess. "Mostly?" he asked, smirking. "What does that mean?" Jake leaned back, stretching his arms. "Oliver forgot you have to butter the bread first." Oliver shot him a glare. "I didn't forget. I just didn't know." Alex chuckled, shaking his head. "Remind me to show you how to use the stove properly before you burn the place down." Jake stretched lazily. "You actually cook?" Alex leaned against the counter, eyes twinkling with mischief. "I know how. I just never have the time." Oliver glanced up at him. "You have time now?" The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He had spent his entire life convinced that time was the most valuable thing he had, but in that moment, he realized that perhaps he had been wrong. Time with his sons, this chaos, this mess, was worth far more than any deal or deadline. "I guess I do," Alex said slowly, after a pause. "Maybe I'll teach you both something that doesn't involve burning bread." The next day, Alex did something he never thought he would do. He canceled a meeting to cook dinner with the boys. When he walked through the door, carrying a bag of groceries, instead of his usual briefcase, the surprise on their faces was undeniable. "You actually meant it?" Jake asked, his eyes wide. Alex rolled up his sleeves with a grin. "What? You thought I was bluffing?" Oliver stood, impressed. "I mean, yeah." Alex smirked. "Well, you're about to learn that I don't bluff." They spent the evening cooking together, Alex teaching them how to make pasta from scratch. At first, Jake was more interested in throwing flour around than actually cooking, while Oliver focused intently on perfecting the dough. But as the night wore on, they found a rhythm. By the time they sat down to enjoy their meal, Jake leaned back in his chair with a satisfied grin. "Okay, I'll admit it," Jake said, his voice tinged with surprise. "That was actually kind of fun." Oliver nodded, a small smile breaking through his usual stoic expression. "Tastes better than the stuff from a box." Alex raised an eyebrow. "Because you made it yourselves." Jake eyed him thoughtfully. "You know," he said slowly, "you're not as bad at this as I thought you'd be." Alex felt a pang in his chest. Jake's tone was different now, hesitant, almost vulnerable. Alex knew what this meant. Jake was testing him, seeing if he would stick around. Would he be here tomorrow? Would he still be their father when things got tough? "I told you," Alex said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, Jake believed him. As the days turned into weeks, their lives slowly fell into a new rhythm, one that was messy and unpredictable but filled with meaning. Mornings no longer revolved around the rush of business meetings, but were now about getting ready for school, packing lunches, and making sure Jake had his baseball glove. Evenings weren't consumed with emails and work calls, but spent in front of the TV, laughing over pizza and playing video games. Alex had finally come to understand something he hadn't before. Life wasn't about control. It was about connection. One Saturday morning, as Alex sipped his coffee, he overheard the boys talking in the living room. "So, do you think we're staying here for good?" Jake asked, his voice quieter than usual. Oliver hesitated before answering. "I don't know. I think so. He hasn't said anything about us leaving." Jake sighed. "Yeah, but what if he changes his mind? What if he decides he doesn't want us around anymore?" Alex's heart tightened at those words. They still didn't know. After everything they had been through, they still didn't know if this was real. If he was real. He stepped into the living room, and both boys went silent. Their eyes darted up to meet his, uncertain. Alex walked over, setting his coffee mug down with purpose. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly, his voice strong and reassuring. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "You say that now, but—" Alex interrupted him, his gaze unwavering. "No what-ifs. I didn't know about you two before. That wasn't my choice. But now that I do, I'm not going anywhere. You're my sons. And that doesn't change just because things aren't always easy." Oliver studied him carefully, his eyes searching for any sign of doubt. "Even if we mess up sometimes?" Alex smirked, his eyes softening. "Especially if you mess up sometimes." Jake huffed a laugh, the tension easing from his shoulders. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight that had hung over them for so long began to lift. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were starting to believe. Later that day, they took a walk through Central Park. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a quiet afternoon in the sun, but it was enough. Jake tossed his baseball back and forth with Alex, while Oliver sketched nearby, capturing the moment when Oliver finally showed them his drawing. A picture of the three of them standing together, Alex in the middle with Jake holding a baseball glove and Oliver with a sketch pad. Alex felt something shift inside him. It wasn't guilt or regret this time. It was a sense of belonging, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he had found something worth holding on to. It was a beginning of something new, something real. And Alex knew with certainty that he would never let it go. The sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the city skyline. As they walked toward the car, the evening air was cool, but Alex felt warmth creeping into his chest. The city lights flickered on in the distance, a comforting hum that had always signaled the end of another day. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the quiet rhythm of life felt fuller. Oliver, holding his sketchbook tightly in his hands, glanced at his drawing. "It's not bad," he muttered, his voice a little softer than usual. Alex studied the sketch carefully, seeing beyond the lines. It wasn't just a picture of them. It was a snapshot of everything they had become in such a short time. "It's good," he said quietly, a sense of pride swelling within him. Oliver shrugged, but a hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Thanks." Jake, who had been quiet up until then, beamed, his eyes lighting up. "I look cool." Oliver rolled his eyes, but couldn't hide the smile that flickered across his face. "You always think you look cool." Alex chuckled, the sound foreign yet familiar, as if the weight he had carried for years was beginning to lift. They were a family now. Unconventional, messy, but real. He had never thought he'd be in this position. A man who had built his life on control and ambition, now being part of something so unstructured, yet so incredibly fulfilling. They reached the penthouse, and the boys disappeared into their rooms. For a moment, Alex lingered in the hallway, listening to the soft sounds of their footsteps, their laughter. The place didn't feel empty anymore. It didn't feel like just a space he occupied. It felt like a home he never expected to have. Later that evening, Alex sat in his office, surrounded by paperwork and a calendar full of appointments. His phone buzzed with reminders, calls, meetings, deadlines. His life still demanded attention, still required constant focus. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, his thoughts weren't consumed by the grind of work. He wasn't thinking about the latest deal or how to expand his empire. Instead, his mind drifted to Jake's baseball league, wondering if it was time to sign him up, or to Oliver's art supplies, wondering if he should get him something new. He thought about school schedules, groceries, what they should have for dinner tomorrow, small things, important things, and for the first time in his life, that was enough. That was everything. This story, Alex realized, wasn't just about unexpected fatherhood. It was about a profound transformation. A man who had spent his life measuring success in numbers, power, and influence, now finding wealth in the intangible. Alex White, once a master of control and calculation, was facing his most challenging test, becoming a father. And not just any father, a good one. What made this journey special was not the revelation itself, but the struggle. It wasn't about a sudden epiphany that made everything fall into place. Alex didn't wake up one day knowing exactly how to be a father, how to raise Jake and Oliver. He had to learn. He had to stumble, make mistakes, and realize that children weren't just responsibilities to manage or problems to solve. They were people, whole, complex, and deserving of his love, his attention, his patience. For someone like Alex, who had spent years living by a strict code of logic and control, this was no small feat. He had spent his life building walls around his heart, shielding himself from emotions that seemed to have no place in the world he had crafted. But now, with Jake and Oliver in his life, those walls were slowly coming down. They made him see that life wasn't about securing the future, but about living in the moment, about putting others before yourself, even when it was difficult. The days that followed were a whirlwind of small, everyday moments that Alex had never truly understood before. Mornings weren't just about rushing through the motions, getting dressed, grabbing breakfast, checking emails. They were about making sure Jake's baseball glove was packed, reminding Oliver to take his sketchbook to school, sharing quiet moments of laughter over pancakes. Evenings weren't consumed with late-night work calls or endless meetings. Instead, they were filled with playful debates over which pizza toppings to choose, late-night video games, and the occasional argument about who was winning. But those arguments didn't seem as important anymore. What mattered was the simple joy of being together, of knowing that no matter what happened, they had each other. One Saturday afternoon, they all decided to go to Central Park. It wasn't a grand outing, just a simple walk through the park, a chance to enjoy the outdoors. But as they walked along the winding paths, something changed in the air. The way Jake tossed his baseball back and forth with Alex, the way Oliver sat on the grass, sketching them from a distance, it all felt natural, like they had always belonged to each other. Jake, after throwing the ball one last time, jogged over to Oliver, his eyes filled with a challenge. "Let me see your sketch," he demanded. Oliver hesitated, a small flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. But when he turned the sketchbook around, Alex's breath caught in his chest. The drawing was simple, just 3 figures standing together. Alex in the middle, Jake with his baseball glove, and Oliver with his sketch pad. But the way Oliver had captured them, the way they stood together, connected, like they belonged to one another, was more than just a drawing. It was a statement. Alex's heart tightened. The feeling was unfamiliar but welcome. It wasn't guilt or regret, but something else entirely. It was a feeling of belonging, of finally realizing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, that he had found something he never knew he needed, a family. As the weeks passed, Alex's world continued to shift. He still had meetings, deadlines, and a business to run. But he wasn't just working for himself anymore. He was working for them. He was doing everything he could to be the father they needed. Even when he stumbled, even when he didn't have all the answers, he stayed. That was the most important thing. And in that, Alex realized something profound. That family wasn't something you could just walk into. It wasn't a given. It had to be built, brick by brick, mistake by mistake, through patience, care, and most importantly, the willingness to learn and grow. At the end of the day, when he looked back on his life, on the wealth, the deals, the accolades, Alex knew the truth. True wealth wasn't measured in money or power. It was measured in the people who waited for you at the end of the day. The people who loved you, even when you didn't deserve it. And when Alex finally understood that, he knew his life had changed forever. He had made the most important investment of all. Not in stocks, not in companies, but in family. And that was something no amount of money could ever buy. As they sat down together for dinner that night, Alex glanced at Jake and Oliver, his sons, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just living for himself. He was living for them. And that was enough.